We put a lot of pressure on ourselves to train our horse every single day. If you're bringing a horse into the domestic world, you need to be able to handle them from the get-go.
Sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees and you need someone else to go, calm down, let a horse be a horse.
It's stressful owning horses, and I do see a lot of people that are like, I'm ready to give up.
And what is the sign of a happy young horse?
If someone's going out and buying a young horse at 2 or 3, you just need to be aware that yes, you can back them at 3 or 4, but
how do we create a well-adjusted horse? And in what areas are we failing our youngsters? Lucy Butt is a fully qualified equine behavioural consultant living in Essex. In 2023, Lucy was awarded the Lordship's Graffelo's Trainers Prize for her dedication to the training of young horses. But what challenges does Lucy herself face as a young professional in the industry? And which behavioural issues are on the rise in horses right now? Let's dive in, shall we? Lucy, welcome to Curious Equestrian.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, when did horses first find you in your life?
So I have been involved with horses since I was 4. Well, technically my whole life. My parents, I'm very lucky to come from very horsey parents. My parents actually met at a riding school that my mum was teaching at.
No.
So that's kind of like a little cute story. So they've had horses their whole life, and they've done all the working 9 to 5, getting up at 4 a.m. to go down the yard and ride. And then so sort of from there, I've always been interested in horses, begged my parents to buy me a pony. So when I was 4, they finally gave in after I'd been having riding lessons, bought my first pony. His name's Sam, and I still have him.
Wow.
We're both 23 now.
Oh.
So we've grown up together. And he was kind of the big start in what changed mainly my mum's view, because obviously I was so young, on how to train horses differently, and she'd been exposed to all the traditional ways of training horses, and that just didn't work for him. He was a very frightened he was a show pony for a long time, for a little while, and then he went into a riding school, so he had a lot of stress, and there was probably some discomfort in there as well. So he sort of started our journey into natural horsemanship. We did a lot of natural horsemanship for quite a few years, and he taught us a lot. We learnt so much with him. And then we got a couple of other horses. So we got my mare, who came to us. She had quite a lot of discomfort. We think she'd had a rotational fall at some point, but we aren't 100% sure. So she had a lot of osteopathy and other like physical things to make sure she wasn't in any discomfort. And then the natural horsemanship worked for her for a little while. But then it just we didn't see the results that we were hoping to see. She was still quite reactive. Her biggest thing is she used to vertically rear, which a lot of that was the pain, but there was also quite a lot of behavioural issues she had as well. So that's sort of where I was introduced to positive reinforcement. So we started down that route, learning as you go, making lots of mistakes and all of those things. And then that's sort of what led me into doing my degree. So I did a degree in equine behavioural science at Writtle College in Chelmsford. And that sort of really sparked my interest. And I'm not going to lie, when I went into that degree, I thought, I've had years of experience with horses. I know everything. And I was sort of that cocky 18-year-old that was like, I know everything. Nobody could teach me anything. And it completely changed my world, because I was just like, there's so much information I don't know. And it really made me realise that the more you know in horses, the more you realise you don't know. And no matter what level of training or experience you've had, there's always more things to learn, and you just never stop.
Even when there is actually not a moment in your life where you haven't been around horses.
Yeah, exactly. And just obviously you pick things up on the way, and you make mistakes and you learn from those mistakes. But I just think there's so much more research now, and research is constantly evolving. We still don't know everything about the horse's brain. There's still lots we need to learn about that. And the world's constantly evolving, the horse world in particular. Everyone's got an opinion. That's the biggest thing. And there's a lot of traditional people that aren't quite on board with our way of training, but that is gradually changing. And I think as we get more science-based research into how horses learn, that's starting to evolve as well.
And how do your methods, Lucy, compare to those that you describe as the traditional way of doing things?
Yeah, so I work on the LEMA principle, which is an IABC, which is International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants. So LEMA basically stands for Least Intrusive Minimally Aversive. So essentially, we want to train the horse in a way that's as minimally aversive as possible, which means that we tend to use positive reinforcement. So what positive reinforcement means is that you're adding a desirable thing for the horse. So a lot of the time we use food when they display a behaviour that you want them to do. So what that does is create more chance of them repeating that behaviour in the future. What we see a lot in the horse world is negative reinforcement, which is not awful, and it's not, you can't use positive and negative in the traditional way that we do, like good and bad. It's not really how it works. But negative reinforcement is essentially adding something aversive and taking that away when the horse does the behaviour that we want. So a good example is putting your leg on when you want your horse to walk forwards and taking your leg off as soon as they walk forwards. They've learnt from that they want the squeezing to go away, so they perform a behaviour, i.e. walking forwards, and then that behaviour stops the squeezing, and they're like, okay, that works. So that's traditional horsemanship, what tends to be done. It's also what tends to be done in natural horsemanship as well. But so we just try and do it slightly differently, so the horse wants to perform the behaviours that we desired from them without having to use the pressure.
It's interesting because I've never thought of squeezing the leg as being a negative. I've always thought of that as being a positive move. You know, it's not kicking, it's not booting. It's just that little communication of a squeeze. How do you train without even the most subtlest movements like that?
And like, obviously it's not that it's like an abusive method or anything like that, but it's just something, it's the difference between how I like to describe it for human communication. If we were to put our arm around someone and gently guide them rather than dragging them, that's sort of how the horse feels in the two different methods. Obviously we can't compare how horses learn to how people learn because we know they're very different. But that's just sort of how I describe it so that people can understand sort of it from the horse's point of view. So essentially how I would teach something like a walk-on cue is I would teach a horse to go from a target to a target. So first we'll teach them to touch their nose onto a target. And when you're very first teaching it, and this is what puts a lot of people off, you have to give a lot of food because you're really wanting that behaviour to be really solid in them and them to enjoy doing that. And then once that's good, you go from one cone to another. And during that walking period, you then can teach a walk-on cue. So usually I use a word like walk-on or something like that, and then you reinforce that word. And then over time, you can gradually get to the point where you just use the cue and the horse walks on until you stop. And that's sort of how you teach it without the use of leg and things like that.
So many things I want to ask you. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to all the supporters that make this show happen, our incredible Curious Equestrian community. Many of you have asked how we can keep in touch between episodes. Well, we've created something super special just for you, the Curious Equestrian newsletter. You'll gain access to our personal insights on every interview, articles written by guest speakers and authors, plus equine experts who are challenging what we think about our horses. If you're as passionate as we are about challenging the status quo and pushing boundaries in the horse world, then you will love our newsletter. Head on over to curiousequestrian.co.uk to join our newsletter community. Right, let's jump back into the discussion, shall we? First and foremost, do you think we so underestimate our horses in terms of the English language? Because so many people you'll hear at various yards will say, oh, you know, they don't understand what we're saying. Or, you know, don't click at that horse. Don't talk to your horse in the saddle. You know, you must use your body, use your seat. And actually, I've always thought if we can click or cluck and ask the horse verbally without having to, as you say, even sort of squeeze at their sides, that is a positive thing. Do you think we underestimate what our horses can understand?
Oh, definitely. And they make such strong associations between things. So, for example, if we've clucked at our horse and they've not gone, oftentimes that's then followed up by a tap with a whip or something. The horse will then learn to go off the cluck because they know that the whip's coming. So they're really clever in how they make associations with things like that. And I think what a lot of people don't realize about horses is they're not logical thinkers like we are. So there's a lot of times you hear people be like, oh, my horse has been really naughty, they bucked me off today, things like that. Or they've made me have a hard day and things like that. That they don't necessarily realize that horses can't forward plan in the same way that humans can. They can't know that they're being naughty. All of their behavior, they're just acting in the moment based on what's going on around them. And the difference between that, they can do something called trigger stacking. So, for example, if you come down the yard in the evening and your horse is just like crazy, stuff's going on, you don't know what's happened, and say they've been out in the field, and as soon as they started grazing, a bird flew up the hedge. That's one little thing that's triggered them to have a frightened response. And then throughout the rest of the day, other little things happened, like it started raining and they hate the rain. And then they ran out of food and etc., etc. And then all of the horses maybe went in without them. All of those things together can fill up in like a glass, and then it can just be one tiny thing that blows it all over. I mean, we've all had days like that where one little thing just blows you up and you don't know what to do. Yeah. And it's the same with our horses. And it can appear to come out of nowhere, but you've got to try to trace it back, and you don't always know because you're not always at the yard, to something that might have happened like 10 hours prior that is still filling up their cup, and then the last thing just makes them explode.
Oh, exactly. So often we put humans and horses separately, but actually you can look at, like you say, a week in our lives and we become more tense as things go wrong. You know, our boiler breaks, work isn't going as we'd like it to. We've got, social commitments that we can't miss out on. We feel like we're running behind, we're running late. All of that builds, doesn't it, into such tension and stress. I don't know why we see our horses differently in that scenario when, like you say, if the herd explodes and they all spook and then they're hungry and then they're the last in out the field, why wouldn't we then say, oh, gosh, we so sympathise with our horse, rather than, oh, you're being a pain today, you're making my life difficult. It's really interesting, the human psychology and how we almost look to blame rather than to understand, first and foremost.
Yeah, definitely. And it is really hard because we've all had days where we just want to go down the yard, just spend some time with our horse, and they're maybe not having a great day, but they pick up so much on like our emotions as well. They're such sensitive creatures like that because it's what helps keep them safe. If they're out in the wild and they've got a lion that's stalking them, we've all seen the videos of lions and horses or zebras sharing the same water source. They're happy to do that, but a horse knows the difference between a lion that's trying to hunt them and a lion that's eaten and is satisfied and is just drinking next to them. And so the fact that they're that sensitive, we've got to expect that they're going to pick up on us. And if we've had a bad day, and especially over the winter when normally we're rushing around trying to get everything done before it gets dark, or we just want to get home and have our dinner, they pick up on all of those little tiny things, and it just all spirals out of control.
And I've got to ask you, you mentioned food as a reward. Now, this is so hotly debated all the time, isn't it? With horses, but also all of our pets. Are we over-spoiling them? Do they become needy? How do you use food as a reward without then the horse becoming niggly and asking for that treat?
So one of the biggest things is using a low-value food. So I get this question all the time, especially with horses that are really good doers, and really don't need any extra calories coming in. And what I say to those owners is use the feed that would have their supplements or things like that in. You can even use hay. Some horses are excited enough about hay. That's rare, but some of them are. But yeah, I always use something low value. So my go-to is always Thunderbrooks chaff because it's not got any molasses or anything in it. It's super low value. You can also feed really big handfuls, so the horse feels satisfied without loads of calories going in. Something like that, or like Thunderbrooks hay cobs if you want something that's a bit easier to carry around. Again, they're a hay replacer, so you're only really given the same calories that you would be from your hay. And in terms of horses being really muggy, that is also a massive one, and a lot of where people go wrong when they start clicker training. So the big one with that is teaching your horse to be neutral. And what I mean by that is when you're very much starting and you're getting them used to what the click noise means, or the word, whatever you're going to use, you need to train them to keep their head straight so that they never get the food when they come to your pouch. I also use a pouch rather than my pocket. So as soon as a training session's finished, I can take my pouch off, put it somewhere else, and they know, okay, session's finished, I'm not going to get any more food at this time, and they'll just go off and eat their hay. Another really good tip for that is having another food source available whilst you're training. So your horse should always be able to have access to hay or something like that, so that they don't feel like they have to come to you all the time. And that's what creates like the frustration and the anxiety in horses. And yes, it can turn into biting horses, but usually that's because it's been done incorrectly or the horse is in pain, something like that.
And Lucy, you've got to tell us, because you won an award last year, the Lordship's Gruffalo Trainers Prize, and this was for your dedication for the training of young horses. Can you tell us about your work in the lead up to gaining that prize?
Yeah, so whilst I was at university, they have lots of rescue horses that come in. So the horse I got to train was called World Horse Welfare Finley, and he was a 3-year-old cob cross, and essentially the horses come in, and as one of our modules during university, you get to train this young horse. So he'd had basic handling, could walk in from the field, he could have his feet picked up, he has had the farrier, things like that. He's never had a saddle on or anything like that. So we were starting all of that from the get-go. And I also want to mention at this point, he was 3. So we were very cautious of not doing too much, because that's another thing I'm really passionate about, is horses are not fully developed until they're at least 6. So we've got to be really careful of what we do. So our biggest thing was him. He needed to build up quite a lot of muscle. So we did tons and tons of long reining, and that's something I still implement now. But during that award, we had the opportunity to go up. I think we had like 2 lectures a week that were like structured, and we had all of our lecturers helping us. So I had my behaviour lecture. We had loads of other ones, so we did lots on farriery and saddle fit and all of those things, so we could cover all those bases with them. We had all of the usual checks that I'd get clients to do, so having their teeth done, having the saddle fitter out to make sure you had a saddle that it's not going to be perfect because they're growing and they're going to be changing, but one that was going to be comfortable to begin with. And then also, so in addition to those sessions, I went up pretty much every day to go and see him and work with him. And I think that's the biggest reason that we made as much progress as we did, because we had, I think it was 6 weeks from start to finish. And I was pretty much working with him all the time. And so it also meant that most of the interactions he was having were with me, because he was obviously a university horse. You've got lots of different people handling him, people of different skill sets, because we had college students as well. Some of them aren't particularly horsey. So that was really useful for me to have that consistency with him being handled a lot by me. And then sort of towards the end, what we progressed to was leaning over him, sitting on him, and then we did some walking. And for me, that was all I wanted him to do, because he was 3, he needed some more time to grow, but it really gave him a really good start. And now, so we're 4 years later, he had a little bit of the winter off, and after he'd had a bit of time off, I then continued working with him towards the end of my degree so I could keep him going. And then over the summer, he had a bit more time off, and then he was re-backed the following year. And he's now walk, trotting, cantering, very happy boy. And I think he's going back to World Horse Welfare to hopefully find him a good home.
Oh.
And I would have taken him home if I had the space and the time. He's a very sweet boy.
Oh, it must be so hard letting him go.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Yeah, so hard. When I spent so long and the commitment to making sure he was as good and happy as he could be. Yeah.
And what is the trick, would you say? And what is the sign of a happy young horse when they're, you know, when they're learning so much, when they're at that age, when they are just coming into their ridden career and their training career?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is variation. No horse wants to be stuck in an arena 6 days a week. I think as long as you've got, you probably heard before about the 3 Fs. So you've got friends, freedom, and forage. And they're even more relevant with young horses. Obviously, all horses need them. But if a young horse doesn't have them, that's when you tend to get a lot of behavioural issues, especially when they're sort of like 2, 3, 4. They're playing a lot and doing a lot with their mouths. That's when I tend to see a lot of people with issues with biting and things like that. And a lot of people's solution to that is to put them in their own field, which usually makes the problem worse. But so in terms of, I really think variation makes the biggest difference. Ensuring you can get them out, take them on lots of walks, learn how to do some long reining, do lots of fun activities, just teach them to go and touch cones and things. All of that will benefit you when you're actually riding. And I think people underestimate the amount of muscle as well that you can build before you even sit on their back. And that's going to massively help them. We all know horses aren't really designed for us to sit on them. So the better we can prepare them for that process, it's going to just make the world of difference. And for me, all of these videos you see of young horses exploding, bucking, rearing, spinning when they're having their first saddling, it shouldn't be like that. It should be done at the horse's pace and really slowly, and you need to have lots of patience. And those first rides should be simple because the horse should be set up for success.
And when we talk about creating or enabling a well-adjusted young horse, where do you think we are failing in the current climate and the current industry as it is with young green horses?
I think we're putting way too much pressure on getting out and jumping and all of these things. I mean, you see 3 and 4-year-olds jumping like 1.20 m, and we know now all we know about their development and how that can affect them long term. And I think that's the biggest thing we're failing young horses at the minute, is not allowing them to grow, because we want to ride our horses and we want all of those things. But I think we just need to be mindful, like if someone's going out and buying a young horse at 2 or 3, you just need to be aware that yes, you can back them at 3 or 4, but you're really not going to be properly riding until they're 5 or 6 if you want a horse for life that's going to be sound and happy. And I think also going back to ensuring that their management's correct, ensuring that they're out in a herd. And I know that that's difficult to find, but there are yards out there. And ensuring that they have that forage and the freedom for them to move around, as well as all the training as well.
What behaviour issues do you commonly see when people ring you up and say, Lucy, I need help with my young horse?
So a lot of general handling, leading issues, a lot of picking up their feet. That tends to be quite a big one. A lot of biting. And horses tend to be, and I don't mean like full-blown teeth, I mean like nibbling. And that, I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of that's because their play behaviours are not being met. And we obviously don't want to play with our horses in that way because they're much bigger than us and it's very dangerous. But that's why you need to have their needs met in a different way. And ideally, that's being out with other young horses. In an absolute ideal world, they'd be out with other young horses and stallions, because that's, in the wild, a stallion's role is to teach them how to play and how to be well-adjusted social animals. Like that's their role in the wild. So the better we can set them up to be able to be well-adjusted horses is really important. And I know there's a lot of controversy about how much do we do with a young horse, like in terms of handling. And for me, if you're bringing a horse into the domestic world, you need to be able to handle them from the get-go. Like, you'll see the good studs out there will do a lot of handling with their foals, but they'll also allow their foals to bond with their mum and be out with other foals and other mares and get the social interaction that way. But I just think it's so important to be able to pick their feet up, have their feet trimmed by the farrier, be able to give them injections, all of those things, because you never know when you're going to need them. And I just think it sets them up for success into their adulthood, because it's much easier to teach a tiny foal than a huge, gangly 2-year-old.
And again, another widely debated topic is that not everyone should own a young horse and back it and break it themselves. What are your thoughts, Lucy, as a behaviourist? Can anyone and should anyone be able to own a young horse? Should it take a certain type of experience and a certain type of equestrian, knowing that they are a cheaper option for those who want to own a horse?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong in people that have maybe had a horse previously to buy a young horse, because you've got horse experience and all of that. But the one thing I would say, if you are someone like that, you need to be prepared. The money you're not paying for a fully finished horse, you need to be prepared to put that money into have someone coming and helping you train it. I think that's a big thing that people are like, well, I've got a budget horse, I want to do all the training myself. And I have a lot of clients like that really want to do all the training themselves, and I'm just there to help guide them down the right road. I have a lot of clients, I don't tend to do a lot of actually like the first sits on horses, because most of my clients want to do that themselves. But we get them to a point where they can do that. And I think that's the biggest thing, is having a good network around you of professionals, from your vets, your farriers, your saddle fitters when you get to that point, your physios. All of those professionals need to be able to work together to help you help that horse become a good adult horse. And I think that's one of the key things, is being prepared to spend the time and the money in training that horse. And I think anyone can do that as long as they're prepared to put those steps in.
And again, sort of thinking about the conversations we're having, Lucy, and the language we're using to compare horses and humans again, it's not all that different from raising a child. I mean, there are huge differences. But in terms of, they say that it takes a village to raise a baby, don't they? And that you should be surrounded by friends who are going to help you, family who will be there for advice and support, people that might be able to give you a bit of a break or a nugget, that golden nugget of advice that you'd never thought of, or someone there to ease your anxiety. Would you say it's the same if you're taking on a young horse? You need that community to support you.
I think definitely. And I think similarly with like raising a child, I think you have all these opinions around you, and people that have done it before, and and it's the same with the horse world. Everyone has an opinion. And I think it's important to take those opinions on and do your own research into what ones you're going to take and what ones you're going to be like, all right, thank you, goodbye. And that especially in like a livery yard setting. Livery yards are some of the most toxic places I think you could ever go, because everyone has a different opinion. And it's really hard, especially if you're a first-time young horse owner, to decide which opinions you're going to take. And I think that's why you need to take those opinions, do your own research, get some advice from professionals, and then make your own mind up at the end of the day, because it's your horse and you do need to decide what's best for them. At the end of the day, you know your horse better than anyone, because you're the one that spends every single day of the week in all weathers with your horse. So you know them better than anyone else does.
And talking of all weathers, Lucy, we are in that period, that difficult season of winter where we do get all weathers thrown at us. We have ice and frosty mornings. We have snow flurries, which we did just weeks ago, didn't we? We have high winds. We have wet rain. We have sort of blizzards. And we have now mild weather as well. So the grass is still growing and the sun is still shining, and laminitic prone horses are still, having difficulties with that, which is unbelievable. But with that in mind, how do we keep training consistent when the weather around us isn't?
Yeah, so that is such a difficult situation for all horse owners over the winter. And I think one of the biggest things is don't put too much pressure on yourself. I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to train our horse every single day, and the quality of that training isn't necessarily great. So what I try and do personally with my horses is my horses are out 24/7. So they have the exercise. I know not everyone has that luxury, but hopefully your horse is out for at least half the day. So they have the exercise from that point of view. So don't stress too much about the exercise. Obviously, if you've got an overweight horse and you need that exercise plan in place, then that's a different story. But there's so many exercises and bonding things you can do with your horse just in their stable. And I've this December, actually, for the first time, I've set up a December challenge. So a lot of people have got involved, and you get new video every week of a different task, and pretty much all the tasks you can do in your stable. So it's really helpful, and it's just kind of helps people get a guide into getting into positive reinforcement, doing something nice with their horse that takes 5 minutes. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we don't quite appreciate that we can do something productive in 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be an hour-long training session. It can be 5-10 minutes of something productive that your horse enjoys, gets them out of their stable if they're in for long periods of time, gets their brain thinking, and you'll just have a happier and healthier horse that's wanting to do things with you. But also, I think not putting pressure on, like, so many people give their horses the winter off. And I think if they're getting enough turnout, that's the big one. If they're getting enough turnout, then there's no shame in giving them the winter off to just chill. I think at the end of when you bring them back into work, when the weather starts to improve, you'll probably be happier because you've not had to spend hours and hours out in the rain every day. And I think your horse won't really mind.
And do you know what? You've taken the question right out of my mouth, Lucy. I was going to say, what's your take as a trainer on, in quotation marks, throwing your horse out for the winter, as we hear it in the industry, don't we? Sort of turning them out all winter long. And it's actually, as an owner myself, who this winter my mare is going to just be a mare in the field 24/7 with her miniatures for the winter, for that exact reason, because she, as a horse, in my way of thinking, gets her time out to be a horse. And, you know, who wants to have to ask their horse to do different training methods, different training regimes during what is actually really, at the moment, diabolical weather, when everything's flooded and we're up to our knees in mud. So my thinking is it's better for us all if we all come back into work in February with a smile on our faces. But it's great to hear that you also think that, Lucy. What do you do in the winter when you've got clients ringing you up and there are issues with turnout limitations?
Yeah, so I obviously have had quite a few. And I've also had quite a few people with horses on box rest. I've actually myself just had a horse come off of box rest. So I know how stressful that can be as well, especially if it's completely, you don't have a choice. They've got an injury. They have to be in. They've gone from, like, so my pony was out 24/7 with his herd, and he had the choice to come in if he wanted to, and then being completely confined to his stable really caused a lot of stress to him. And I think from that point of view, I do a lot of, like, management consultations over the phone on, like, how we can improve your horse's life in their stable. Obviously, the absolute ultimate is that you find a yard that has those facilities, but I know that's becoming increasingly more difficult, especially when we get even wetter winters. The fields are just completely, I mean, we had fields that were drenched in the summer. Like, it's so difficult. So I think there's a lot of things enrichment wise we can do to help horses cope with being in a bit better. So even something simple like hanging their hay nets in different places around their stable, so they're not just standing in one place all night. Things like treat balls are really good. You can get, like, licky mats for horses, and they have a similar effect to how they do on dogs. So they just help bring their stress levels down a little bit. Things like that. I make a lot of, like, cardboard boxes with hay and, like, different things in them for them to snuffle through, putting different treats, like, within their hay so they have to forage for it, trying to create all of those natural foraging behaviours that horses do in the wild, but in their confined space. And yes, it doesn't completely bring their stress down, but it can help a little bit to make them a little bit happier in a situation that's kind of unavoidable.
Is that one of the biggest problems you see in the wintertime when people ring you up asking for help?
Yeah, massively. And it's so difficult because a lot of the time people are trying their absolute hardest, but they just don't have a choice. They're landowners, and often landowners aren't necessarily horsey, so they don't necessarily understand. They just see that their field, they don't want it to get all muddy and trashed and stuff. But they don't necessarily see the impacts that will have on a horse. There are a lot of yards now that will allow you to at least put your horse in an arena for periods of time, which is better because at least they can have a little run around. And obviously you've also got the risk of people are then worried to put their horse out because they're going to run around and injure themselves. And I know my pony that went out at the beginning of this week, we were standing there on tenterhooks and we'd taken him for hand walks. He was completely cleared by the vet to go out. But we were like, we know he's going to run around because he's been cooped up for 3 weeks. He's going to run around, and you're like, I don't want him to redo that injury. And it's difficult, but horses are going to be horses, and they can, I mean, the pony that I had on box rest, he actually did his injury in a stable. So so it's like, you can't guarantee that keeping them in is going to keep them from being injured as well. I mean, like you see even like Carl Hester, all of the big names in, I know Ben Atkinson recently posted a picture of all of his horses out in a herd and like things like that. I just think you're going to have a much happier horse at the end of the day. And if they're turned out regularly, the chances of them running around and injuring themselves are a lot less.
It's so difficult and it's so anxiety inducing, isn't it, as an owner? Because all you want to do is wrap them up in cotton wool and look after them and make sure they're okay. But your words are so reassuring. Let the horse, sometimes you have to just let your horse be a horse. And that's what you have to keep in your mind. And certainly that was my mantra in the spring. We had a herd of horses move just through the woodland. So my mare was standing at the edge of her fence line, and suddenly there were all these new faces peering through the trees, and she couldn't touch noses with them because they're a separate herd about 10 metres away, and I'm not friends with the owner. I don't know the owners. So we couldn't introduce them. And I felt for her because it's like, wow, you've got all these new friends and all you want to do is say hello and meet them, but you can't. And I can't explain why we can't just go up and meet all these new friends. And she just spent 3 days cantering up and down, prancing, spinning, showing off, showing all her best moves and what a show off she is. And I had to just stand and watch, trying to offer buckets of water and offer food to try and to make sure she was hydrated. And I felt for the first time so powerless because I've always kept my horses on sole use yards, so I haven't had that external voice from livery owners or other liveries. But I've never had to factor in a herd that isn't our own. So I thought, what do I do? And after 3 days of prancing around, she injured herself. So in the stable she went. She lives like your horses out 24/7. So she didn't like being in. And then every time we put her back out after it had healed itself, she did the strain again because she wanted to see the friends. And in the end, I said to him, I rang up my farrier exasperated, like, what do we do? What do I do? And he said, just let her be a horse and she will realise that by sort of prancing about on her strained leg, it's going to hurt and she'll calm down and she'll stop. But you've just got to let her limp about a bit and realise what's going on. You can't keep trying to protect her by putting her in the stable. So in the end, I had to sort of let go and just step back and think, please, Winnie, work it out. But that is incredibly hard. And that comes back to your point of having a support network around you, because sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees and you need someone else to go, calm down, let a horse be a horse.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it's so hard, especially in our industry. There's a lot of people suffer from mental health issues because it's stressful owning horses. And you don't know what's right. There's so many opinions online. You look online and you're more confused than when you started. And it is just sometimes just someone, it doesn't even have to be a professional, just go to you, it's fine. Everything will be fine. Your horse will survive. And it really just does take that, like, because we can stress about it all we like. I know as horse owners, we always have sleepless nights where we're like, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? And at the end of the day, if your horse is happy, then you're doing a good job.
And we're always looking, aren't we? We're always looking for something that might be slightly out of kilter. And then on comes the feeling of, could we have done more? Could we have done anything to prevent it? It is, when things are going swimmingly, it's the most beautiful and life-enhancing experience owning a horse. But when things go wrong, it can have such a detrimental effect mentally and emotionally, can't it?
Oh yeah, massively. And it is so difficult to know what's right or wrong, and there is no right and wrong. It's every horse is unique, every horse is an individual. It's like us as people. There's not one thing that works for everyone. And I think, yeah, you might not be doing exactly the same as your friend up the road, but their horse might be in a different situation to your horse. Their horse has had different previous life experiences. All of those things are big factors. And it's really hard to not compare ourselves to one another. And there's a constant feel of competition. Like I used to do quite a lot of dressage when I was younger, not so much anymore. But it just always makes me laugh when you look at it. And it's like, we're paying and giving up our weekends to go and ride around an arena and be told how good or bad we are. It's just, I feel like we're just setting ourselves up to be sad about it, you know?
And just circling back to talking about time out as a herd and turnout for horses, what do you advise your clients when there is limited turnout at a yard? And like you say, a landowner may not be horsey, but they obviously own the property. What's your first bit of advice in that scenario?
Yeah, so my ideal is if you're only allowed to turn your horse out for a part of the day, people often always go for the daytime. And that's a very human perspective on it. But actually, if you think about it hourly, if you turned them out in the evening, they're going to have a lot longer out than if you turned them out, say, at 8 o'clock in the morning and then brought them in, because most horses have to be in before it's dark. So most of them are brought in at 3.
Oh, yes.
That's a much shorter period of time than if they get turned out at 3, 4 or 5 o'clock and then they're brought in at 8 o'clock the next morning. So that's a big thing that I think we think about the day split in 12 hours and 12 hours. But when you actually work out the hourly, it's not 12 hours. So that's a big bit of advice I give people. If you only have half the day, use the evening, because it's the longest period your horse is going to be out, and then they can be in during the day. If that's not even an option, we'll go back to the enrichment stuff we can do, training things. And I think if your horse is in 24/7 and you have no way around that, you need to make it a priority to get them out, and not just so they can stand outside their box whilst you muck them out. They need to go for a walk or something. And if they can go out in an arena, stretch their legs a bit, that'll be great. But I think that's where we go back to what we were talking about, giving them the winter off. I think in that situation, you just can't.
No.
Because they're not getting that movement. And even from a physical point of view, they need that movement. They need the blood circulating around their body. And they just don't get that standing still in a stable. So I think that's really important, taking them for a hand graze, things like that. I think even a 10-minute hand graze, if your horse is in 24/7, that's going to be the highlight of their day. And I think it's just sacrifices like that. Whereas if they're out 24/7, then they can be free. They can have the winter off. It's great.
And it's interesting because when I mention always having kept my horses on a sole use yard so that it is just me, my mum and our herd of horses. We've got 2 little miniatures and a rescue 15-hand cob cross Connemara. They're all rescues actually. And that sounds quite idyllic, but actually in our time we've had to really fight, as you say, those who own the land who aren't horsey, to say, please don't panic about the churned up mud. We need the horses to be out. They've had traumatic backgrounds. They are personalities that get anxious inside the stable, and it's how they've always been kept. Please engage in an open conversation about what we can do, but allowing us to keep them out 24/7. And actually that can be really hard, and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety to actually have the bravery and the courage to brace those kind of conversations. But I can say from personal experience, although it's a bit of a journey to get there, once there is a level of understanding, you can then, as long as the landowner's willing to work with you, you can put your case forward and come to a positive outcome. But I can imagine for many where some wouldn't listen and actually would say, I'm really sorry, but there's poaching and we can't stand for that. I imagine then the stress and the trauma of then having to move yards or, like you say, find a livery, find a field somewhere in an increased situation where there's less and less land.
Yeah, and that is really, really difficult. And there is a lot of landowners, like you said, that are just not horsey and just don't understand and aren't willing to engage in that conversation. And in situations where that happens, I am very happy to get involved for my clients and advocate from a science-based background of why it's important. Doesn't always work, but sometimes it's enough to not just be well, this is what I want to do with my horse. and actually back it up with, this is what my horse needs to have their basic survival met. And in situations where it's not possible, we just have to make the best out of a bad situation. And like even things like offering to reseed the land come when it's an appropriate time to reseed it, things like that, I think offering to maintain it in that way, because it is their land at the end of the day, and they don't want it wrecked. If they've got a purpose for it at some point, then they don't want it to be completely poached up. But there are lots of things, like my fields right now are basically mud baths, but we've got like rubber matting or like mud mats set up so they have dry places to stand and things like that. They're obviously really expensive, but there are some cheaper alternatives that might be good to form, like put in the areas that tend to have a lot of traffic to prevent some of that mud build-up. Not always possible. And then potentially taking them up and reseeding them, if your landowner's happy for you to do that, can be a good way of bringing a practical solution to, we know it's going to get poached. This is what we're going to do once the weather allows us to, and we'll rest it and make it back to normal for next year.
I'm wondering, Lucy, you're very early on in your career, aren't you, as a horse behaviourist? When you look ahead, considering how important turnout is for our horses, what do you imagine in the future, in 20 years' time, when, you know, we see our countryside getting more and more built up, we see our towns and cities less and less green spaces and places to keep horses? What do you imagine for the future of our horses?
It's quite scary to imagine, because I fear that we are, like you said, going to have less and less space and less options. It's going to become more expensive. But I think we're already seeing such a drop in horse ownership. So many people are giving up because, one, they either can't afford it, it's too stressful, or a mixture of all of that. And I think we're going to see that even more. And we've already got a welfare issue in the UK, well, in the world, especially in the UK, because of the lack of land and finances and all of those things. All of our rescue centres are just full. So, I mean, I would encourage people, if they're considering getting another horse, to get a rescue so that we can try and keep breeding rates down as much as we can, because it is going to become a real issue. I know that's not always possible, and for various reasons, but I think trying to breed as minimal amount of horses as we can, because we just don't have the facilities and the space. And I think, like you said, in, say, a horse has got a 30-year lifespan, by the end of that horse's life, we don't know, it might just be built up everywhere. Horses are going to be living in flats.
It's a real issue now, isn't it? So we can only imagine what that landscape of the future looks like, but actually what the landscape of our country is going to look like. And for our really large four-legged animals, that is going to have a serious impact. When you mention people giving up their horses, Lucy, are you seeing people at their wits' end in terms of people coming to you for support and advice? Are you seeing that in your training, that people are on the verge of giving their horses up?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time when people call me out, it's a last resort. They've gone down every route of vets, and they've like had their saddle checked, they've had their horse's teeth done, all of those normal checks that we do as horse owners. A lot of the time they are at the absolute end of their tether, and most of the time that horse has been displaying those behaviours for a very long time, and that can take, again, a long time to unpick and a long time to get them back to a normal state. And that can be really difficult, because the last thing a horse owner wants is to be told they've got another 6 months before their horse is back to normal. But unfortunately, most of the time the horse has been displaying a lot of behaviours behind the scenes or like really subtle behaviours that people haven't necessarily been picking up on. So the horse feels like they've been displaying these behaviours for a long time, and then they just explode. And I do see a lot of people that are like, I'm ready to give up, can't do it. This horse is just so complicated and has got all of these issues. And there's not a lot of people that are prepared to then take that horse on. And that's where it can get really difficult. Is like, well, where do you go from there? All of the rescues are overrun, and oftentimes it's sport horses and things like that that are less likely to get rehomed from a rescue. So it's really, really difficult. And I work at I have some clients at Remus Horse Sanctuary in Essex that that I go to twice a week, and you're seeing the effects. They do an absolutely amazing job, but they're really feeling the impact of like the cost of living crisis. People aren't willing to donate money or don't have money to donate anymore, but the cost of everything's going up, and it is like a bit of an upward battle of trying to get these horses homes that they're happy in. And the other thing is, now our veterinary care's got so good that horses live longer, which is great. But it also means that a horse is now like a 30+ year commitment. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily, well, you don't know what you're going to be doing next week a lot of the time. People just don't know how quickly their life could change. They could lose their job, they could lose their house. And unfortunately, horses are a luxury. So they're the ones that tend to suffer, and not because the owners want that to happen, but because they just don't have a choice.
Such powerful words, Lucy, and difficult to hear, isn't it? It's a difficult conversation to have. I read a statement the other day that said there is no such thing as a forever home for a horse, because someone doesn't know if they're going to get divorced or if they're going to, like you say, lose their house. And I think that's a particularly difficult conversation to hear at the moment, when we are in a cost of living crisis and when we know people are struggling to even afford the heating in their house or the food on their table, let alone their horse and the rent and all of the bills that come in association with the horses. What's it like going into the sanctuary each week, and how do you support the sanctuary as a behaviorist? Because you must be seeing horses of all different types coming into the sanctuary.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, their number one goal is all of their horses are always fed and always happy, and they've got a lot of lamanitic horses that they built purpose-built bark pens for, so they still have turnout. And it is really difficult for them, and you see them, like, obviously I'm there to train horses, but you see them running around. They're really busy. Everyone's always doing stuff. They have a lot of really lovely volunteers, and one in particular I work with and have helped her to help train a lot of the horses they have there, because they've got some that have got quite complex trauma history. And so it's really good that she's been able to take on a lot of that training so that they don't have to pay me to be there more times a week. And obviously I give them a discount as well. But it is really hard, because if it was my choice and I wasn't running a business, I'd be there for free every day of the week.
Yeah.
But that doesn't pay my bills. And it is really difficult, because you go in and you know that they are sometimes struggling financially. If they've had, like, for example, this summer, they do a lot of events to try and bring money in and things like that, and they had to cancel a lot of them because of the weather. So it's like, that's really difficult as well. Some of their big fundraising events, they just couldn't run. And then you've got that lack of funds, and it is really, really difficult. And especially when you've got horses that have quite complex needs. They have quite a lot of elderly horses, and it's really hard.
And Lucy, how are you finding it as someone who is early in their career, a fairly new graduate as well? People assume that where there are horses, there is money. And actually, many horse owners, I know from experience as well, put all their life savings, all their life earnings into their horses, and actually they would try and keep them until they absolutely couldn't. So how is it having this current climate a knock-on effect on your business and your earning power when people are struggling to keep the horses?
Yeah, so the behaviour world is a difficult one in itself, because equine behaviorists aren't a protected title. So anyone can call them a behaviorist, no matter their experience or anything like that. And that's why things like the IABC that I mentioned earlier exist, to try and govern it in some way. So there'll be a lot of people out there that charge a lot of money when they don't necessarily have the experience and the qualifications to back that up, and the constant CPD training to keep up that knowledge and learning all of the new stuff that's coming in. So that's a really tricky one in itself, because you'll have people that have had a bad experience with someone that calls themselves an equine behaviorist and isn't one. And equine behaviorists and horse trainers are different people. I do a bit of both because of my young horse background and my young horse experience, but they are different people. Like, someone that wants to you want to improve your dressage is not the same as an equine behaviourist. I wouldn't go out and tell someone, oh yes, I can get you up to Grand Prix. So things like that can be really difficult because people have had negative experiences with them. And sometimes also because we have to have a lot of difficult conversations with the owners, and we have to have a lot of conversations with vets and other paraprofessionals, that I found in particular, because I'm quite young and I look quite young, I'd get a lot of backlash and like other professionals not really listening to me. And that can be really difficult because I respect them and their profession and how hard they've worked to keep up their knowledge in their specific field. And it doesn't seem like there's the same sort of respect for people that have studied and have experience in behaviour. It doesn't seem like it's like a separate thing entirely. And that can be really difficult. And also from like an earning perspective, a lot of my clients, one of the biggest things I've found is a lot of my clients are in different places. And because I tend to go to them once or twice and then get them on a plan to help that behavioural issue, they then don't need me anymore. So I have a few clients that I go and see regularly for their young horse training and things like that. But apart from that, most of them are like 1 or 2 or 3 sessions and then they're rolling, and which is exactly what I want. I want them to have that behavioural issue fixed. But then hopefully if I've done my job well, it's fixed for life.
Yeah.
So that's a tricky thing as well, because it's not like your physios and your farriers that, you know, you're guaranteed to see them every few months. So that can be quite a difficult thing. And a lot of them, because of that, tend to be quite spread out. So there's a lot of driving, so it's difficult to fit multiple clients into one day. So things like that are really tricky. And especially like going back to the winter thing now, it's so dark in the evenings. And if you're lucky to have lights in your arena, everyone wants to ride at the same time. So it's difficult for you to have a lesson, things like that, which means my weekends are very busy, which is lovely. But yeah, so that could be
squeeze your
well.
5 days, working week into your weekend, which I imagine must be a nightmare. And Lucy, it's really interesting you mentioned about your age and being young, because how do you battle against that when the only way to be an experienced equine behaviourist is to work as an equine behaviourist and bring all the experience of your lifetime from your studies, but also each week you're learning new things. How do you persuade someone to look past your age, even if they're much older than you and they've had horses all their lives?
So that's obviously a very difficult one. And I tend to just go back to my experience I've had prior to going to university and how I've developed that since university. And I go to a lot of regular like conferences and things like that to keep up my knowledge. I also am really lucky to have a good support network of other behaviourists around me. So there's lots of us that we go to each other for advice and things like that. So like when I was at university, my lecturer, she's a behaviourist, and she has a lot of other behaviourist friends, and they're always willing to give us advice. And if we've got a particularly difficult case, we'll just chat through it. And so it's really nice to have like that sort of support as well. So it's like my advice isn't necessarily always coming from me. It's coming from someone much more experienced than me that I've had the conversation with and provided some ideas. And they've been like, this has worked for me. And it is like, because every horse is unique and you'll have a plan going into a session, but you might have to change that on the spot because the horse might not be responding to that. And it's really, like you said, you can't get that experience without just doing it and going out and experience those things. You can shadow as many people as you want, but you have to have that hands-on actually being able to do it. And a lot of that, I did a lot of work after I finished my degree, I went to America for a month and did a lot of training out there at a guest ranch. And so I did a lot of backing young horses and things like that. And it's really interesting for me. They don't necessarily do things in the way I train horses now, but learning to train horses in different ways, I think, is really beneficial, because then I can have the experience of what issues or good things I might see from a horse that's trained in a particular way.
And it is fascinating how we operate as humans and how society operates, because I had a really interesting discussion on Curious Equestrian with a guest called Andrea Wadey. And if anyone missed that episode, do go and listen back. And we talked about the perils of how older riders, older trainers, older equestrians are seen and perceived in the industry, and that actually there's an element of being overlooked when you're older. And isn't it interesting that you're talking about ageism at the other end of the spectrum, and actually not have people presuming that you don't have the experience, you don't have the expertise because you're young, and because you look young as well. You know, not all young people look young, and there's that level of judgment, isn't there? And I think as an equestrian industry, it seems that on both ends of the spectrum, there's a lot of judgment, and it's seemingly a lot of ageism.
Yeah, I think definitely. And I really think that we can learn a lot from everyone. And I think that's where some people are missing. They're like, well, I'm going to go to this particular person. But so for like example, this weekend was the horsemanship showcase. It's an event they run every single year at Bury Farm. And it's got loads of different horsemen and women from all different backgrounds. You've got people that specialise in liberty. You've got natural horsemanship people. You had a lot of clicker trainers there, which is really great to see. They had Lucy Chester and Equus with Millie, which was really lovely for that community to start getting out there. And it was really popular. But there, I think, is a really great example because you've got a weekend worth of learning, and you'll see all of the other people that are actually presenting will go to different people's talks, because even though they're at a professional level in their sort of sphere of the horse world, they can still learn from everyone else. And you do there have a mixture of age groups and genders and things like that. And I really think it's a nice environment somewhere like that where people can just be like, well, I don't know everything. I can learn from someone else, and I might pick up things and be like, I'm not sure that's 100% agree with that, but you might pick up something and be like, oh, never thought of it like that. That's really clever. And I think we need more events like that to help people be like, okay, well, I don't know everything. Let's accept that I don't know everything and see what I can absorb from other people.
It's so interesting, Lucy, that we are ending the episode in a similar vein to how we began, circling back round to the fact that you said you went to uni saying, I felt like I knew everything and I was proven wrong. And actually now you're encouraging everyone to be open-minded. Lucy, as a young behaviourist with a fresh perspective, what do you think you bring to the equestrian industry?
So my biggest thing I think I bring is not just my practical knowledge, but my theory knowledge and my constant advancing on scientific research that comes up and about. I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to pay a lot more attention to in the horse world, is all of these new scientific discoveries. We're still learning how horses' brains properly work, and we should alter our training methods to suit that and not just have a one-size-fits-all model, because it just doesn't work with horses. They're all individual, and we need to have that ability to be flexible and adapt. And I think that's what I bring to the horse world, is being able to see the horse in front of me and be able to adapt and change my plans, and also see the owner, because different owners have different time constraints and things like that, and be able to come up with a plan that works for both the horse and owner.
Lucy, thank you so much for delving into so many different topics over the last hour. For those listening thinking, oh, I need some of that gold dust from Lucy, how can they get in touch with you?
So I'm on social media under Lucy Butt Equine Behaviorist. I'm also got a website under the same name. So I'm on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. Any of those, just search Lucy Butt Equine Behaviorist and I'll pop up.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for coming on Curious Equestrian. Thank you so much for listening to and watching Curious Equestrian. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube so that you don't miss an episode and all that's coming your way, or you can subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you listen. If you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that would really help us to find lots more lovely listeners. And you can also follow us on Instagram @Curious Equestrian Podcast. We'll see you next time.